Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Welcome to Scary Stories. Tonight we've got well over an hour of scary stories, including werewolf transformation stories, an Everglades Dogman story, and even an urban city werewolf tale. In fact, let's start it off with that one. But before we do, if you'd like to see us stay online, a way you can really help out is to leave a like on the video. That lets me and YouTube know that you want more. If you leave a question or comment below, that can help also. If you leave a troll comment, I admit I might delete it. Unless you make me laugh, then it could go either way. Now it's time to dim the lights and get ready for over an hour of scary dogman and werewolf tales. Enjoy. Across the street from a werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC. This story happened just after I finished college and had a job in a delicatessen in town. I was living in a small room I rented near the deli, although my girlfriend was trying to get me to move in with her. She had a nice, large, sunny apartment, but even half of her rent was still more than I was paying for my room, so I was resisting her idea. Eventually, the situation would be resolved for us by the Dogman. I don't want to say too much about the location in which this took place because I'm still a bit paranoid about the entire thing, but let's just say it happened in the Midwest in the earlier part of the 21st century. When I was moving in, one of my neighbors had noticed that I collected Star Wars stuff back then. I don't anymore, but at that time I was a huge fan. Let's call this neighbor Brad, which was not his real name. He told me that he was friends with a guy living across the alleyway who had the ultimate Star Wars collection of action figures and so forth, and that I had to come visit his place at some point. He claimed the guy's collection was like a Star Wars museum practically. I said great, but never expected to ever be thinking about the subject ever again. Now, my apartment was at the edge of town, and I had a supermarket on the corner, plus fast food places, and basically everything I needed within a 3-block radius, so I could save money by not driving. If you exited our building in the rear or via the alleyway, you were only a block away from a park that was not very manicured. It was sort of like a little forest, and I liked going there when I needed to be alone. It felt like I was walking deep into nature in just a few minutes. I almost never saw anyone else using the area, but this story is about one of the only times I ever did. While I was sitting under a tree and not thinking one day, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, and I heard some sounds as though someone were running away. What I thought I had seen was something impossible. I really thought I had seen something that looked like a werewolf from the movies running past, as though a dog ran by on its hind legs, I guess you might say. I knew that wasn't possible, so I wondered what I had really seen. I stood up and took a few steps in that direction, then wondered if I really wanted to know what or who was actually there. It might be something I couldn't unsee. Chickening out, I headed back to my room to not think there instead. I found myself doodling the dog-headed man I had seen whenever I had a pen in my hand for the next couple weeks. I don't draw very well, so I don't think the image was clear to anyone else, but I kept trying to capture what I thought I had seen. It remained a mystery and started to gnaw at me more and more until I went back to the woods to see if I could catch another glimpse of whatever it was. I saw dog prints there, but I don't know anything about tracking, and I couldn't tell if it were walking upright or in the normal down on all fours kind of way, so it wasn't really useful information. The tracks did seem large to me, but I don't really know what normal-sized dog prints look like, so I had nothing to compare them to. Okay, so fast forward to one day when I saw my neighbor Brad from my building on the sidewalk. He was talking to some other dude with a unibrow. He told me this was George, the guy with the Star Wars collection, and they both invited me up to his room to see his stash. I had some free time before work, so I said okay and went up with them in the elevator. I noticed his building was cleaner than ours, even though it was right next door, and I asked what the rent was. Turns out it was even higher than my girlfriend's rent, so I stopped asking any other questions about that building. When we got to the guy's apartment, it turned out he did have an entire room full of shelves with Star Wars action figures and games on them, and 3 or 4 cosplay costumes displayed on life-size mannequins. His homemade Boba Fett costume was truly impressive. After he finished the tour of that room, he took us back to his bedroom to show us some more rare items, some of which I had only heard of and never actually seen before. George and Brad got lost in an in-depth Geekland discussion of something or other, and I did a double take because I noticed that George's bedroom window looked out directly onto my room. Through my window, my place looked like a mess. I decided to buy a shade, embarrassed to see what my life looked like from the outside. The two of them asked me what I was looking at, and I told them nothing, not wanting to call attention to my lack of private life on full display right outside. So that was the first time I met George, which is obviously not his real name, and we exchanged phone numbers. I think I had his first and last name programmed into my old, tiny cell phone. That was the era of flip-top phones with an antenna on them that you had to pull up before making a call. At any rate, he was a contact filed away and forgotten about. In spite of our mutual interest in science fiction, we had failed to hit it off in any significant way. So, one night, around 3 a.m, I woke up to the sound of someone falling over a garbage can in the alleyway below. I got up and groggily looked out my window to see if I could see what was going on. What I saw nearly made me faint. There, in the alley, 2 floors below me, was the thing I had seen out of the corner of my eye in the woods that day. I grabbed a drawing I had done of it and held it up by the window. That was it exactly. I wondered if I were dreaming, and I became cynical. I wasn't sure how to tell if this was real or not, but I felt it was too impossible to be real. Remember, I was still half asleep. My attention was drawn back to the creature as it staggered to its feet, holding its side as though it were in pain. I pulled my recently bought shade down and turned off my room light. Then I squatted down and observed the action. It was not apparent whether the creature had hurt its side when it tripped over the garbage, or if it was hurt beforehand, which led to it tripping over the can. In either case, it appeared to be limping a bit and having some trouble walking. It really was a man-type creature, but covered in hair and with a dog head. The ears were upright, and the snout long, like that of a wolf. It seemed to be mainly gray, but with all shades from black to white sprinkled in. It was very monochromatic. I did not see its eyes from my angle, but it had a tail like that of a beagle, long and bony like a whip. I saw it leaning back to look up, and I pulled my head back down. Peeking, I could see it was looking up at the fire escape of the building across the alley. That was when I noticed the ladder was down at the bottom. The creature leaped and grabbed the bottom rung, letting out an uncomfortable grunt when gravity pulled him down again. Although he was obviously uncomfortable, he was also more athletic than almost anyone I'd ever seen, and he scrambled up the fire escape in no time flat to the 3rd floor. Once there, it wasted no time diving feet first into the open window of... Wait, wasn't that George's room? I panicked and grabbed my phone. That thing was going into George's apartment. I needed to call him and warn him. A second before calling, though, fear froze my finger. If I told him what I had just seen, I would also be revealing which window was mine. I would also be revealing that I had an awareness of which window was his. I would be making it seem as though I had been spying on him, which I really had not been doing. Guilt consumed me. I wasn't sure what was the right thing to do. I called the police instead. I gave them George's address and apartment number, told them I saw a prowler go in the window, then hung up when they started trying to ask me for more information. Then I went back into peeking out the window and waited for something to happen. His apartment seemed dark and quiet, and it looked like someone had closed that fire escape window. Eventually, the cops arrived, but left again just a few minutes later. Confused, I went back to bed and tried to get some sleep before work. A couple of days later, I ran into Brad and George on the sidewalk again. Brad called me over and told me that George had just gotten out of the hospital. They both told me that George had fallen in the woods and had a broken rib to show for it. I acted as though I weren't really interested, but actually, I was kind of in shock by the implication of what they had just told me. All that day at work, I was distracted. I hadn't dreamed of seeing that werewolf. I really had seen it, and it really had climbed up to George's room, because it was George. Before leaving work, I asked my girlfriend if the offer still stood for me to move in with her. She said yes, and I started packing that very night and moving things over to her place the next morning. Even though George was always nice to me, and even though we shared a common interest in the old Star Wars movies, I had no interest in living across the alley from a werewolf.
If you want a coloring book full of monstrous delight, then give this a look. It'll give you a fright. Scary stories, coloring book, werewolf coloring book. And just to make your mind explode, it's a digital download. All it costs is $2.09, and then you will be feeling fine. Coloring monsters today, it's a coloring book, hooray. Okay, link is in the description.
Werewolf of the Everglades. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Most of the Dogman and werewolf stories I hear you tell take place a long time ago, in the dark of night and in the middle of the forest. My one encounter with the strange happened in broad daylight, down in the swamps of the Florida Everglades. and only about 3 years ago. Okay, I had just broken up with a girlfriend right before this incident happened. My usual thing to do after a breakup is to resume whatever it was that this particular girlfriend had interrupted. Women will usually try to change something about you, get you to break up with friends she doesn't like, or get you to throw out stuff you collected that she thinks are uncool, or get you to stop listening to a certain kind of music, whatever. This particular girlfriend had sort of forced me to stop my interest in cryptids and in nature generally. I used to go out squatching before I met her, and I hadn't since. So, to help myself get past this loss, I decided to go out to the closest natural area near where I was living over there in Florida at the time. That was the Everglades. I decided to jump in the car and go look for the skunk ape. I wasn't up to making a full expedition yet, but I had heard there were wooden boardwalks built through parts of the jungle down there, and I decided to have myself a stroll just to see what I could see. I don't remember exactly where I was that day, but I found one of the parking lots, parked, and got out to walk. The wooden path over the swamp went right up into the lot, giving one of the wildest jungles in the world this sort of Disneyland ride feeling. It must not be dangerous if it's easily accessible to tourists. My subconscious mind seemed to accept this without question. There were no other cars in the parking lot, though, so I was happy at the thought that I might get to be the only human out there, seeing whatever it was that I was going to see. So imagine my disappointment when I got out on the boardwalk and I saw another person down a bit further. I stopped short and decided to leave him his space and just catch the view from where I was. There was very tall grass, and in places you could see that most of the ground under was actually shallow water. It smelled like stuff was rotting all around, and I imagine that was because stuff was rotting all around. I heard something making an odd moaning sound, and I imagined it was an alligator somewhere hidden in the tall grass. I don't really know what it was, but a splashing sound from the same direction seemed to support my thesis. When I got bored looking at the vegetation, I turned around and checked out the view from the other side of the walkway. I eventually tired of that too and wanted to walk further in, not go back to my car. I turned to see if that man had walked on, but he was still in the same spot as before. He was not looking out at nature any longer, however. At first I couldn't understand what he was doing, but then I realized he had removed his boots and was taking his jeans off in a manic fashion. This sent alarm bells off inside of me, and I immediately began walking back the way I had come from. I tried to act nonchalant and relaxed, but I was a bit nervous. I checked over my shoulder to make sure the gentleman was not heading toward me, and I saw that he looked differently than before, but I wasn't sure exactly how. I walked on further before chancing another glance behind me, and in the place of the man stood a very tall, bear-like creature. Now I began to jog out, as this was the most upsetting thing I had ever seen. I was terrified right there in broad daylight on a hot and sunny day. Something was happening behind me, which was impossible. I no longer wanted to see anymore, and I swore I would never ask for any explanation as long as I could get out of this situation unharmed. A loud splashing sound drew my attention, and I turned to see that the creature that had been a man only a minute earlier was now up to its broad, hairy chest in the water beneath the bridge and was wading out into the swamp at a remarkable speed. It was like the water offered no resistance at all for this creature. It must have been unfathomably strong to make the time it was making. No longer threatened as the creature was speeding away from me, I had a chance to see it from the back. The shoulders were massive and human-like, but the head seemed like an animal. It resembled either a dog head or a hog head, with tall ears on top. The hair was bristly like a wild boar, but thicker, like that of a dog or a wolf. I don't know where it was headed, but it sure seemed in a rush to get there. To wrap my mind around what I had just witnessed, I turned back to where the man had been, and, sure enough, I could still see his clothes and boots left right where he had taken them off. I felt an overwhelming urge to go inspect the clothing, but my fear of how fast that creature could move overruled that urge. I resumed my march back to the parking lot and beat a hasty exit out of there. A couple of weeks later, I made friends with some squatchers, and when they asked me if I knew a good place to hunt for cryptids, the Everglades did pop into my mind. But what I had witnessed was apparently some sort of shapeshifter, if it wasn't just a hallucination on a hot summer day. Most Bigfoot hunters don't accept the idea of shapeshifters, or they didn't back then at least. So I kept my mouth shut about the entire incident. I had nobody with me to corroborate what I had seen, and I certainly had been under a lot of emotional stress immediately prior to the occurrence. Maybe it never really happened. Maybe my mind projected the entire thing out there, and maybe it all happened inside my imagination. For all these reasons and more, this right here is the first time I've ever told anyone about the werewolf of the Everglades.
Now he's a sticker, sticking to my butt, sticking to my wall, everywhere I look, sticking where you like, with some exceptions, nothing to get, it's in the description. I'm gonna call him Scary Sticker Man, yo.
Smithson the Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story for you about a werewolf I used to know back in the 1990s when I was in my 30s and living in Merrill, Wisconsin. I was walking down a path in the Kruger Pines State Natural Area on the west side of town when I saw my old friend Smithson walking toward me. He and I had attended college together back in Milwaukee, and it was quite a surprise to see him where I was. Although we had been inseparable in school, I hadn't seen him in years, so I immediately called out his name and hurried towards him to say hello. As we started chatting, we exchanged our current addresses and phone numbers so that we could get back in touch. After only a minute or two, though, Smithson suddenly began to convulse. I was shocked and horrified as I watched his body twist and twitch uncontrollably. I didn't know what to do, and my mind raced as I tried to figure out how I could help him. I asked him if he was okay, but of course he didn't respond. Instead, he simply continued to convulse and writhe, eventually falling to the ground. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to figure out how to help. Should I call an ambulance? Should I try to give him first aid? I quickly realized that I had no idea how to help someone in the middle of this kind of a seizure. I had never been in a situation like that before, and I felt completely unprepared. In a panic, I looked around for help, but the street was deserted. The nearest hospital was miles away, and there was no one else around to help. I was alone, and I felt completely powerless. I tried to comfort Smithson as best I could, telling him that everything would be okay, and that I was there for him. but he was still convulsing. And I could see his eyes turning an amber kind of color. I felt sick as I saw his face reconstructing itself into something entirely inhuman. And it wasn't just the skeletal structure under the skin that was moving about either. I saw a nauseating dark leather blemish form on his upper lip. Then, as his face stretched out forward, the black leather fit over the end of Smithson's new elongated dog or wolf snout. He now had a black leathery dog nose at the end of rows of teeth fearsome enough to bite through your throat like it was a piece of birthday cake. This was no longer my college chum. In fact, he looked like he was going to turn me into chum. My heart was racing as I watched in horror, and the spasms continued. Smithson's body began to shift and contort, his limbs stretching out and reforming into long, slender legs. A thick coat of fur sprouted from his skin, and his fingers fused to form paws. As if in a dream, I stumbled backward, unable to tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. Smithson was no longer human, but a large, furry dogman with gleaming eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. For a moment I couldn't move, frozen in fear and shock. But then the dogman leaped toward me, its jaws snapping shut. Instinct kicked in, and I turned and ran as fast as I could, the sound of its growls echoing in my ears. He chased and chased. As fast as I could run, it seemed slow to him. When I finally ran out of breath, I turned and looked, and I saw those eyes. Those amber-colored eyes. I couldn't look away, as Smithson's eyes seemed to pull me in deeper, almost as if they were vortexes leading to another world. The orange color of his eyes was so vibrant. It was as if they were alive and pulsing with energy. As I gazed into them, I thought I noticed something peculiar. It was almost as if there were tiny flames flickering inside of them, dancing and swaying to a rhythm that I couldn't hear. I felt as though I were peering into the past, present, and future simultaneously, all while being suspended in the abyss of his amber gaze. It was an otherworldly feeling that was both captivating and unnerving, like I was seeing something that I wasn't meant to see. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of secrets were hidden behind those piercing amber eyes, and what kind of power they held. There was something about the orange color of his eyes that made me feel as though I were staring into the heart of a great mystery. They were both beautiful and eerie at the same time, like the eyes of an angel and a demon combined into one. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply uncanny and otherworldly about Smithson's eyes. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, as if they were portals to an alternate reality, a world beyond our own. For a moment, I felt myself being transported to that world, as if the flames inside Smithson's eyes had engulfed me, and I was lost in a sea of orange. But just as quickly as it had come, the feeling disappeared, leaving me feeling strangely empty. As I pulled my gaze away from Smithson's strange eyes, I saw that my old friend was entirely gone, replaced by a beast, like something out of a Hollywood horror picture. The creature's eye level was the same as Smithson's had been, but then I realized it was crouching. Once it unbent its form, all the way to its standing height, I had to crane my neck back to see those orange eyes, now in the skull of a beast unlike anything my eyes had ever borne witness to before. The animal charged at me, all fury and fangs, and I thought my life was over. Both his paws landed hard on my chest, and I began flying backward, my feet up off the ground. I slammed hard on my back as I landed, and then that beast landed even harder on top of me, squeezing all the air out of my lungs, and as I later found out, cracking one of my ribs in the process. But he didn't stick around to eat my face off as I expected, so I was grateful. Instead, he just used me to break his fall, then ran off somewhere behind me. I was painfully gasping for air and feeling pretty bad for some time after that, so I couldn't focus on where Smithson ran off to in his werewolf form. When I got home, I called the number he had given me, and I left a message on his answering machine. Then I collapsed into bed, avoiding my wife's questions of why I looked like I had been in a fist fight. I didn't want to talk to anyone but Smithson about what had happened, and Smithson wasn't really in shape to have a conversation at that moment. And apparently he wasn't the next day either. I called his machine and left multiple messages, but he didn't call me back, so I was thinking that I should call the police and maybe tell them about what happened. I left him one more message saying I was going to do that, and he picked up the phone while I was talking. You could do that in those days before cell phones when we used answering machines. So Smithson started yelling at me that I was being a jerk and interfering with his personal lifestyle, or I don't know, something to that effect. I'm not remembering his exact wording, this is a long time ago. I reminded him that he had thrown me to the ground, and he's lucky I didn't have whiplash or a concussion or something like that. And he calmed down a little bit. I'm not sure he remembered that part, to be honest. We agreed to meet for lunch to talk about it, and I knew a restaurant where we could get a booth in the back and not be overheard by others. Although he did show, Smithson was reticent about divulging too many details about his werewolfism. He kept trying to pull an attitude like I was being rude and I was prying. He kept asking me if I would ask so many questions if he changed his religion or changed his political party affiliation. I laughed at the idea of comparing being a werewolf to voting Democrat or Republican, but he kept doubling down and tripling down on what he called me judging him without walking a mile in his moccasins. I reminded him that werewolves don't use moccasins, and he got up and stormed out of the restaurant. I did try to call him after that, but eventually he either moved or got his phone number changed, and I figured that was the end of our relationship for good. Well, I sort of wish it had been. One night I woke up to hear a tapping on my bedroom window. It was persistent, and sometimes got sort of frantic. It was too annoying to sleep through, though, and I began to be concerned that a bird might be stuck or something. I got up and walked over to the window, which was on the 3rd story of an apartment building, and outside. I saw the glowing orange eyes of an upright canine, somehow balancing on a tiny ledge outside that window, far above the ground. I screamed and fell backward into some furniture, and the beast man outside my window simply jumped backward off the ledge. I got up and opened the window and screamed, sticking my head out in time to see the werewolf down 3 floors beneath me, running away on 2 legs into the woods behind our building. He wasn't injured. He wasn't even limping slightly. I didn't know for sure that it was Smithson, but I figured it had to be. He might not have been the only werewolf in Wisconsin, but he was the only one I was having an ongoing argument with. Not long after that, my wife and I were out celebrating our wedding anniversary at a club because she likes to dance. I admit that I had been drinking that night, so I'm not as sure of what I saw that time as I am with the other incidents. I think I saw Smithson. I saw him across the dance floor. I headed over toward him, leaving my wife behind me, because I wanted to have a conversation with that guy to get something straight between us. I am positive I saw him there. Well, pretty positive. But then again, I had been drinking, so maybe it was just someone who looked like him, but when I got to the area I thought I'd seen the man in, women were screaming, and men were trying to catch this very large bat. At least it looked like a bat to me, although it was as big as an eagle or a vulture. I just grabbed my wife and got out of that club before calling us a cab. There was no way I could explain to her what I'd seen. Either I was drunker than I thought, or there was a shape-shifting monster inside that club that was likely to come out front looking for me if I didn't get us away from there fast. Now, at this point, I started to read old books I found in our library about werewolves and other supposedly fictional monsters like vampires. Did you know that in some European traditions, the vampire can change form into animals and creatures? You see it sometimes in the movies when, like, Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee will become a bat and fly away. Well, another animal associated with vampires is the wolf. Dracula himself refers to wolves as the children of the night, and he calls their howling sweet music. And Dracula is also able to transform himself into a wolf at will, same way he can become a bat. Now, when I read that, it really blew my mind. So Smithson might be a werewolf as I'd been thinking all along, but then again, if that huge bat I saw in that dance club was real, and judging by the screaming women it was, could that have been Smithson? And could Smithson actually not be a werewolf, but a vampire who can turn into a werewolf? Now, to me, the idea that a vampire can also be a werewolf as just sort of a subset of his powers exploded my skull with ideas and possibilities. The more I read about Dogman and werewolves, the more I wondered how many of the Rougarou and werewolf stories might not be about sorcerers who transform themselves into werewolves, but actually about modern-day vampires who do the same thing. I was very excited about these ideas, but my wife absolutely forbids me to discuss any of this with her, so I was feeling pretty crazy, like I needed someone to bounce these ideas off of. No, I don't really want to become a person who believes in vampires, but I was literally faced with an angry werewolf already, so how much further of a jump was it really to begin to suspect that my former friend Smithson might be a vampire? Of course, the implication is that many werewolves in many sightings would then possibly be vampires as well, and that's the part that explodes a lot of the way I used to see the world. I had one more encounter with Smithson, and I hope for the love of God that it was the final one. We moved away from that place, and I'm not even going to hint about where we each moved now for obvious reasons. We had to uproot our entire lives. It feels like we practically live in a witness relocation program. But when I tell you about what happened, hopefully you'll understand our decision. One night we went to the movies, and as my wife and I left the theater, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The street was deserted, and the silence was deafening. I tried to shake off the weird sensation, but there was something in the air that raised the hairs on my arms. Just then I heard a familiar voice call out my name. It was Smithson, my former college buddy turned enemy. I hadn't seen him for a while, and I was a bit relieved that he was at least in human form. But there he was, bold as brass, staring us down with a cold, dead look in his eyes. "Hello there, old friend," Smithson said, with a devious grin. "It's been too long." I wasn't sure what to say, but before I could even think of a response, something started to happen. Smithson began to shake and convulse right in front of us. His eyes turned yellowy amber orange. His skin stretched and contorted into an eerie shape. Before our very eyes, Smithson turned into a huge, hulking werewolf. My wife screamed, and I tried to shield her from the beast, but it was no use. Smithson had become something beyond anything I'd ever seen. The werewolf was huge, with teeth as long as my fingers, and claws as sharp as knives. It growled at us with a deep, menacing sound that shook me to my core. Smithson, or the werewolf that was once Smithson, started to step closer to us. My wife huddled under my arm, trembling in fear. I knew I had one chance to save us both. With a deep breath, I reached into my pocket, and I pulled out a silver crucifix, my last line of defense. I held it out in front of us, and the werewolf flinched. I wasn't sure if it was because silver was the only thing that can defeat a werewolf, or if it was because a crucifix is considered poison to a vampire. Then again, it might have been for some other unknown reason, but in any case, he didn't like it being shoved in his face. Without a second thought, I lunged forward with my crucifix, thrusting it toward the behemoth in front of us. The werewolf let out a howl, and then it was over. Smithson lay on the pavement, shaking and convulsing, but this time he was human again. I laughed triumphantly, but before I could even finish my chuckle, he was off the ground, and with his right hand tightly around my neck, which was quite painful. I didn't realize at first that his left hand was similarly placed around the neck of my wife. Then he lifted us both off the ground, and our legs swung as he strangled us with his vice-like hands. "Did you think I needed to be in wolf form to show you what I think of you?" he asked me. I couldn't say anything in return. I couldn't even breathe. He could have ended everything for us both. But as we were about to pass out, he dropped us, and we fell to our knees before him. Smithson gloated about how good humans looked when they're on their knees. It almost made us seem likable, he said. Almost, but not quite. Holding my head up by the chin to make certain I was conscious, Smithson told me that my wife and I had to move out of the state before 24 hours were up. We were never allowed to physically enter Wisconsin again. And then he detailed the terrible things he would do to my wife if I ever came back. My wife said that she couldn't leave because of her job, and Smithson told her that she was going to leave a message for her boss on his phone, telling him things I can't repeat here. Both of us were told to resign in an abrupt, rude, and unprofessional manner over the phone, and then be out of the state before we even made arrangements about where we would stay. And if either of us complained, Smithson said he would only make it worse and worse. Somehow we knew that we were going to do what he was telling us to. We'd be giving up both of our careers and all of our friends and family, and we'd be putting ourselves at financial risk while we drove around jobless and homeless until we were able to put down roots in some new place, which we never really did. Not together, anyway. The stress of all this was too much, and we both took up with different people in different locations. Smithson had broken us up completely. My wife was now scared to even be around me. Whenever we communicate, she asks me if any of my other former enemies have come out of the woodwork yet. And that is the part that really bugs me. Smithson was mad at me. He is probably still mad at me to this day, but all I actually did was leave messages on his answering machine asking him if he was okay. I wasn't prying into his private life. I was inquiring about a man I thought was a friend, who I had just seen suffer a horrible attack. And for that, my wife and I were torn apart, and it took us both years of hardship to create new lives for ourselves. Doesn't seem fair. All I was doing was looking out for an old college buddy, and now I have none of my old friends anymore. I'm afraid to reach out to any of them. I don't want to draw Smithson's vengeful attention to them. And so I have to say, knowing a werewolf is not always all it's cracked up to be, especially if the werewolf you know is Smithson. My daughter can't help being a werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I'm a man trying to raise a teenage daughter without her mother, who passed away some years back. It's the legacy of her mother that Stacy has to live with. You see, my wife was a werewolf, and now that Stacy is becoming an adult, she is following in her mother's footsteps, unfortunately. This girl was shy growing up, but she's practically a recluse now. She can transform 2 or sometimes 3 times a month, and it is around the full moon. But she can start to grow hair on her arms or her eyebrows thicken, or she even starts to get a sort of a 5 o'clock shadow just randomly, unannounced, and she doesn't even sense it happening. This can be a hard time for any young person, but a girl suddenly growing a beard randomly is a terrible setback to her social life, which hadn't even really had a chance to begin yet. I want to find specialists to take her to, but Stacy doesn't want to end up in medical journals and then history books as the freak wolf girl. I tell her that she'd be helping other girls like herself out, but that doesn't help. That's the kind of thing that matters to guys, I think. Stacy told me she wants to have a family of her own, and she wants to sacrifice for them, not for some random idea of other girls like her. She doesn't want attention. She wants love and a husband and children, but she's not going to get them if she's afraid to come out of her room. Stacy's still got half her senior year in high school to make up for, but she says she will get an equivalency diploma someday. Neither of us care about her going to college because, we're not communists who hate America, so my only concern is helping my daughter find a way to meet other guys around her age that she can socialize with, guys who are going to be men about her situation and not little babies. She's going to need a guy who's up to the task of being a husband to a woman who changes when it's the full moon. Well, I mean even more than usual. I have not had to lock Stacy up when she transforms. In fact, she usually stays next to me, whimpering through the entire episode. I'm not sure it will get worse, but she says she feels that it will. She has not fully transformed yet, but the situation does seem to progress a little each month. At this rate, even if it continues worsening, I still don't think she would fully transform until she was in her later 20s. Maybe it comes in spurts though, and maybe next month I'll be finding myself fending off a feral animal. Or maybe next week. Or maybe never. Not all dogs are prone toward viciousness. And some wild canines never get good at hunting and have to scavenge instead. So even if Stacy does progress into more severe transformations as she moves into adulthood, I don't consider it a guarantee that she would necessarily have to be a nasty one. Some dogs are timid and scared. Have you ever comforted a dog during a thunderstorm? Stacy's been that kind of werewolf, at least so far. I don't think this situation makes her stronger. I think that for her, this really is a curse or an illness. Sooner or later I will prevail upon my daughter to let me bring her around to be examined. Maybe because her case seems milder than the other ones I hear about on your channel and elsewhere, she might be able to be cured. And that might open doors to this subject being discussed more openly. We can't bring an end to werewolfism until we allow it out of the closet and allow science to study the subject. Any doctor right now who announced that he was going to study lycanthropy would be ending his own career. Well, maybe Stacy and I can change that. Or maybe she'll win out and remain in hiding. In neither scenario does she get the family she wants, and that's what I would rather help her get. It's hard to know what to do when you really can't understand the situation you're dealing with, and the only thing I can tell for certain about all of this is that my daughter can't help being a werewolf. Man dog. My dog is a werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I would like to alert you and your listeners to the fact that werewolfism is not merely an illness affecting human beings. It can be caught by canines as well, including your house pet. I learned this the hard way, back in the 90s, when my mixed breed mutt named after Data from the Star Trek got infected and became a werewolf for the last 4 years of his life. Those were not easy years either for us or for him. Still, he lived to be 12, which is not all that bad in dog years. We had to put up with an awful lot toward the end though. When he passed, it was during the new moon and had nothing to do with his werewolfism. So this was not a tragic thing, really. Data had a family surrounding him, who were all pulling for him. Otherwise it would have ended much sooner, and much nastier as well. So I'll try to start this at the beginning, but none of us really can be sure what the actual beginning was. He was 8 years old before the first time he became that other thing, and he only changed on the full moon. Someone once suggested to me that he always had been a dogman, but he only matured at age 8, and that wouldn't explain why he only walked upright under the full moon though. And that wouldn't explain why he grew human ears when he transformed, just as humans are said to grow dog ears when they become a werewolf. So how did this happen to my dog Data? Was he bitten by a human being? I mean, we don't know that he wasn't. So here is what happened the first time Data the dog transformed. I was inside the house and I heard the dog growling at something out back. Then I thought I heard something larger growling back at my dog. From the sound of it, there must have been a bear or a timber wolf or something big facing off against my pet. So I grabbed a baseball bat and I headed outside. But when I got out there, it looked to me like Data wasn't facing anything larger than a squirrel that was up in a tree. I was confused about where that growling was coming from. So I walked out there into the yard to see what was going on. Well, that was a mistake. Data turned to face me, and I screamed. His head wasn't his head anymore. It was sort of like a skibbity toilet moment way back in the 80s or 90s. It was this guy's head on my dog's body. And so I screamed. To be clear, it was not an ordinary man's head. It looked like he was transforming into a man and then stopped somewhere about a third of the way through the process. It was horrible to look at. Sort of nauseating, really. His head had grown taller, as though his brain had as well. He had a forehead now, and he had human ears on the sides of his head. He also still had his dog ears on top, though. That's what I mean when I say he looked like he got stuck in the middle of transforming into a human. It wasn't just his head that was weird either. His arms looked much more human than before. Yeah, I said arms, but I mean his front legs. Now they looked like arms, and one of them was nearly bald. That made it look even more human than the other one, which was still covered in fur. Neither arm had a hand at the end, but the paws that were there were more like clawed hands than paws anyway. As far as I can remember, his back end was mostly the same as before, but he seemed far more energetic, and he seemed far more feral and angry as well. I know I said he had grown a forehead, and I know it looked like his brain must have grown larger, but he certainly did not act any more intelligent. In fact, he seemed downright stupid to me. I called out to my dog questioningly, wondering what had happened to him. He turned his attention toward me, and then I swear he bared his teeth and crouched down, making a snarling sound, like a wild animal might. He was about to pounce on me. My own dog of 8 years had lost his mind. I ran to the house, and he sprinted after me. I screamed and he landed on my back, which sent me into a panic. I spun around, allowing my momentum to pull me down, and I landed hard on my dog, who was no longer my dog, but a man dog. This worked to knock the wind out of him enough that I bounced off and got a few steps head start on him toward the back door. Data, or whatever the hell he had become, got up and ran after me on his hind legs. I was screaming like I saw a ghost or the boogeyman, I swear to you. The whole world had gone crazy. It was insane. Or maybe I was insane. I got my hand on the doorknob, but Data was right behind me. So I closed my eyes and swung my Louisville Slugger as hard as I could. I felt it hit the monster that was once my dog so hard. I'd have cleared the fences in a Major League ballpark with that hit. It only knocked that monster back a couple of steps though, and he fell on his butt. That gave me time to get inside and close the heavy door behind me. Only a second before the man dog threw all of his weight into it. I hadn't even had a chance to lock it yet, But believe me, I double-locked it once I could. The man-dog ran off into the night, and I had no idea what I should do about it. Should I go out and hunt my own dog down? What if he attacked someone out there? I didn't know what had happened to him. Maybe he had some kind of rabies. Maybe I should call the cops about him. I talked about it with my wife, the one I was married to in those days. She felt I might only cause a panic. We had seen the man-dog running toward the woods. My wife felt that he was out hunting smaller prey. She didn't think he'd run into town or anything like that. And if he did, half the town was carrying heat in those days, so the problem would get taken care of in all likelihood. Her thinking seemed cold to me, which I think is why we eventually divorced. But I followed her advice that night anyway. Honestly, I was too scared to go out there after that man-dog anyway. When it stood up on its hind legs, it was taller than I was. Plus, I didn't want to hurt Data, but he had no qualms at all about trying to hurt me. It wouldn't be a fair fight, you know? So basically, we spent the night watching TV programs scheduled for us by the rich, which was what everyone all did at the same time in those days. And then we went to bed after Jay Leno's monologue. In the morning, it was like none of this had happened. Data was at the back door looking like his old friendly self again, asking for breakfast. I was so happy to see him. I didn't think twice about flinging the door open and giving him a big hug. I threw his frisbee and we launched right into a game like nothing had ever happened. In fact, if my wife hadn't also seen him running into the woods on his hind legs the night before, I would have just decided that I was working too hard, and I had imagined the entire episode. But my wife had seen the man-dog, and she ordered me to figure out what to do before nightfall brought the monster back. I rigged up our basement with a heavy-duty chain and a collar that was supposed to be strong enough to hold a lion. I installed a new strong security door at the entrance to the staircase leading down to the cellar. Then, when the late afternoon came, I brought Data downstairs with some food and water and some of his toys, and I chained him up. Then we played games and hung out, and we both fell asleep together down there in each other's arms. I woke up with a blanket thrown over me, so my wife must have been brave enough to venture downstairs and check the scene out. Data didn't become the man-dog again the next night either. I declared the entire thing a fluke, but my then-wife noted that it had happened on the night of the full moon. I checked the calendar and she was right. So the next month, I started chaining the boy up in the basement 2 days before the calendar said the full moon was gonna be. Sure enough, on the third night, that dog turned into a freak all over again. I had to run upstairs and bolt the door from the other side. The most horrible noises came from downstairs, and my wife forced me upstairs to bed where I couldn't sleep. This was how we lived for the last 4 years of that boy's life. I wish I could understand how this had started. Then maybe I might have been able to figure out what to do about it. My wife suggested that I speak to the pastor at our church. Possibly the dog is possessed, she reasoned. So after church one Sunday, I made an appointment to talk to the pastor in private about it. When I explained that my dog transformed once a month into a werewolf man-dog, he remained very quiet. After some extended silence, he suggested that we both pray for guidance on this subject, and then he opened the door for me to leave. When I got home, my wife told me that she'd received a panicked call from our pastor, telling her that her husband had lost his mind and urging her to leave town before I got back home. Needless to say, we found a different church, and we never told that second pastor about our man-dog problem. There was one time that I saw Data change on a day that was not the full moon, and that is a story unto itself. He and I had been playing frisbee, and then we were sitting together on a warm autumn evening. It was sundown and just starting to get a little bit chilly. I was waiting to get in the mood to walk home for dinner when both of us saw this white light off in the woods. It was dusk, not quite dark yet, but not daytime anymore either, and I couldn't figure out what could be making such a bright light. I felt a sense of alarm that it might be a car or a motorcycle or something driving right at me and Data through the woods. So I stood up, trying to see it better. When the light emerged from the foliage, I didn't see any vehicle or person behind it. I just saw what looked like a very bright, big light, and that seemed to be all it was. There was nothing behind it. There wasn't anything behind it, and I couldn't see what the light was made of other than light itself. As the light came into the clearing that I was in with Data, I noticed for the first time that the dog was standing at attention on all fours, staring intently directly forward at this light, frozen in place and unmoving. And then I noticed he had the man-dog head, and he had the man-dog arms. He was the man-dog, but he had not gone feral. He had frozen into place, staring directly at the light in front of us. He was so still that I couldn't be sure he was still breathing. I had never seen anything like this in my life. I've never seen anything like it again either. Suddenly the bright light lifted straight up into the air, and Data stood up on his hind legs to watch it disappear into the sky. Only it was Data again, not the man-dog. He barked at the light as it receded upward and out of our sight, and then the two of us walked home. How I wished I could ask that dog questions about what had just happened. I wished I could get answers from him about what was going on. I wondered if that light had something to do with him becoming a were-dog, and I still wonder about that to this day. I suppose it might have just been a random weird thing that happened to us, but I guess I'll never know. I took him to a vet I had known for almost 20 years, but the guy listened to my story and then told me I needed a shrink. He told me that Data should be taken away from me, since I was having fantasies that he was a werewolf. I asked him if he wanted to come to my house on the full moon, and he asked me if I could hear how crazy I sounded. He told me that if I came back to him with a video that supposedly showed my dog becoming a werewolf, he would take moves to have me committed. My lawyer told me a vet couldn't have me committed, but I became rattled from his extreme reaction. I really didn't want a reputation as a lunatic or a dog abuser, so then I became afraid to tell anyone what was going on. Now so many years have passed and I'm so old that I just don't care if you think I'm crazy anymore. And that's the story of Data, the man-dog. Submission query. A Ranger's Encounters. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am writing you as an old woman who has spent 3 decades of her life married to a park ranger in Michigan. My husband, who passed away 5 years ago, had an uncanny ability to spot things that were never supposed to be there. He would come home from his shifts in the park and tell me stories that would make me shiver in fear. He would always say that he was not allowed to talk about these things, but he had to tell someone, and that person was always me. I have never shared these stories with anyone else, but I feel that it's my duty to let them be known. I have a collection of stories in my head that my husband left behind, stories recounting his encounters with creatures that are not officially recognized by any authority. Some of these animals he described as having a surreal presence, while others were almost too human-like for comfort. Now, I believe these stories would fit perfectly in with the Scary Stories NYC format, and I'm eager to share them with your viewers. My husband's experiences while on the job have been officially classified as confidential, but I think he would have wanted them to be heard by more than just me. He would always say, "There are things that lurk in the forest that no one ever sees." I believe that these stories would be of great interest to your viewers, as they delve into the unexplained and the supernatural. As I said, I have an archive of these incidents locked away in my brain, but sooner or later I will pass on, and the stories will too. I am confident that these would be of great interest to your viewership. Thank you for considering my query. I look forward to hearing back from you soon. Sincerely, etc., etc. Story number 1. A Dogman encounter in Michigan. One particular story that my husband shared with me involved the time he thought he was trailing a thief through the woods at night. He was working the late shift and noticed someone moving about suspiciously. My husband decided to investigate and followed the shadow for a while. As he got closer, he realized that the figure was too tall to be any human, yet it was walking on two legs. He thought that maybe he stumbled upon someone wearing stilts, but he dismissed that notion when the figure disappeared into the bushes right in front of his very eyes. While he was still puzzling over what he had just seen, my husband suddenly heard a growling sound from behind him. When he turned around, he saw an enormous, dog-headed, and hairy beast man on two legs. He had never seen anything like that before, but it matched the descriptions of the legendary Michigan Dogman. After that night, my husband became a changed person. He was no longer the same carefree ranger who laughed off strange occurrences in the park. To his credit, he never let his fear show to the public, but he knew that he had encountered something beyond normal explanation. He made a point to tell me about his encounters, so I would always be aware of the hidden dangers in the woods. I believe that his stories can help shed light on the things that go bump in the night. I am hoping that Scary Stories NYC will be interested in publishing some more of these tales so that others can know what my husband saw. Story number 2. Werewolf in the Woods. Another story my late husband told me was about his encounter with a werewolf in those woods in Michigan. It was a cold winter night, and my husband was patrolling the park when he heard a loud howling sound coming from the darkness. Curious, he ventured off the path and into the trees, where he saw a massive creature with fur as black as night and eyes that shone like gold. The beast was clearly injured. Its paw was bleeding, and it appeared to be in pain. As he approached the animal, my husband suddenly realized that it was transforming from a wolf into a man. The creature shrank down, its fur receding, and when the change was finished, it was now an elderly native man who groaned in agony. The transformation startled my husband. He didn't know what to do or say, but the injured man called out to him, weakly, asking for help. My husband quickly proceeded to offer medical assistance by dressing up his wound and offering a ride to the hospital, but the man declined, insisting that he wished to stay in the woods. Over the next few nights, my husband returned to the spot where the man had transformed, meeting the old native there and bringing him supplies. His wound healed faster than it would have on a much younger man, and the stranger admitted to my husband that there were some advantages to being able to change one's form. Apparently it speeds up the metabolism, both in terms of hair growth and in terms of healing. And so even at his advanced age, the native chose to live in caves and off the land as an animal. Those two could talk for hours about the woods, the creatures that lived there, and the mysteries that they held. Both had a deep respect for that park, and as a result, they shared many common interests. The native man was a loner and rarely spoke to anyone, but over time, he and my husband became friends. They shared stories, secrets, and adventures, and I assure you my husband enjoyed getting to know this enigmatic stranger. Over the course of their friendship, my husband had gotten to know the man behind the werewolf and had formed a deep bond with him. The wolfman had always been able to keep his animal tendencies under control around my man, but one day, that all changed. It was a sunny afternoon, and my husband was sitting on the porch of the ranger station, enjoying the warmth and the company of a friendly cat that liked to visit him from time to time. As the cat rubbed against his leg, he saw the stranger's transformation beginning. The man who he had come to know as his friend, the werewolf, was suddenly consumed by rage and transformed into his fearsome creature form right in front of my husband's eyes. It was like something out of a horror movie, with the man's bones cracking and rearranging as fur sprouted from his skin, elongated claws extending from his hands and feet. His face twisted into something inhuman and savage, teeth bared, as he let out a deafening roar. My husband was frozen for a moment, the shock of the sight before him leaving him unable to move. The good news is that the cat, sensing the danger, fled immediately. But the bad news is that the werewolf then turned his attention to my husband. His friend was wholly unrecognizable at that moment, consumed by a primal urge to kill. The werewolf lunged forward, and although my husband tried to reason with him, it was no use. The creature was beyond all logic. Without hesitation, he leaped into action, using his quick reflexes to dodge the werewolf's initial attack. The werewolf was powerful and ferocious, but my husband's trained techniques allowed him to keep his wits about him, always staying one step ahead of the creature's wild, unpredictable moves. He was able to anticipate and counter every attack, using the werewolf's own strength against it and managing eventually to subdue it. The beast would lunge. My husband would move away, belting the beast man from behind as he lost balance and slammed hard into a wall. My husband cracked a wooden chair over the werewolf's skull and barely even dazed him. It was only after a few agonizing minutes of that werewolf attacking and causing chaos that he finally calmed down and transformed back to his human form. My husband was left stunned, trying to comprehend what he had just lived through. From that day on, things were never quite the same between the two of them. Though my husband never turned his back on his friend, there was always a sense of tension and unease hanging between them. The incident made him more wary of the man behind the monster, and my husband knew he could never fully trust him in the same way again. That transformation was one of the most shocking things my husband had ever seen, and it became a reminder of just how fragile the line between humanity and savagery can be. The orb. That was not an orb. I remember the first time my husband told me about his sighting of a bizarre light orb moving through the Michigan woods at night. He had been working the late shift as usual, patrolling the park and investigating any suspicious activities. It was a quiet night until he noticed what looked like a group of people shining flashlights in the woods. Assuming it was illegal farmers trying to tend their crops at night, he went in to investigate. As he drew closer, my husband realized that the lights weren't from flashlights at all. They were coming from a strange orb, hovering 2 feet above the ground. What was even more unsettling than that was that the orb was making the sounds of heavy footsteps and raspy breathing. My husband was afraid to move closer, but he was also equally afraid to turn and run away. He stood there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what he was seeing and hearing. The orb moved through the woods, bobbing and weaving like a drunk teenager trying to walk a straight line. And the strangest part of it all was that it seemed to be following him. As the orb closed in, my husband said he could feel a palpable fear washing over him. He assumed it was the farmers, and that they were probably armed and dangerous. But when the orb got within just a few feet, it made an abrupt turn and disappeared into the darkness. A few months after he saw that light orb, my husband was on his usual patrol when he saw it again. This time the orb was moving in an erratic pattern, zigzagging through the woods. As he approached it cautiously, the orb started to morph and take on a human-like form. To my husband's amazement, a huge, 15-foot-tall Bigfoot stood before him. The creature's stench was unbearable, and my husband described it as smelling like rotting meat. But what was stranger still was that the Bigfoot communicated with him telepathically, telling my husband a story about being a fallen angel from a formerly divine lineage. The Bigfoot explained in his mind that he and his people were once part of the angelic realm, but were cast out for not following divine will. My husband said that the Bigfoot's voice was as clear as if it were speaking out loud, and that he could feel the creature's emotions and his thoughts as it spoke. The Sasquatch went on to explain telepathically that it had been wandering the woods ever since it was cast out. It said that it was searching for a way to regain its former grace and become an angel once again. My husband was awestruck by the creature's story and could hardly believe what he was hearing. After this encounter, my husband's perspective on the supernatural changed. He no longer saw these beings as hoaxes or hallucinations or urban legends, but as living, sentient beings with their own histories and belief systems. In sharing his story with me, my husband hoped that he could make sense of and find meaning in these encounters. He never forgot what he experienced in the woods, and neither will I. The Hodag. My late husband always had a way of telling stories that would capture my attention and send shivers down my spine. One particular tale he told me that has always stuck with me was about the time he had encountered a Hodag deep in the woods. If you don't already know, a Hodag is a mythical creature that is supposed to exist in the town of Rhinelander, Wisconsin. According to legend, the Hodag was discovered by a local logger named Eugene Shepard in the late 1800s. Shepard claimed that he had captured a fearsome creature with horns, a green reptilian body, and razor-sharp teeth that roamed the nearby forests. The story of the Hodag quickly became a sensation, and Shepard began exhibiting the stuffed body of the beast at local fairs and festivals. Despite some doubters calling him a hoax, the Hodag himself remained a source of pride and fascination for the people of Rhinelander. The town adopted the creature as its official mascot, and it has become an important part of local lore and culture. The Hodag is celebrated every summer during a festival that includes live music, food vendors, and a parade featuring the Hodag himself. But what my husband encountered was not some friendly mascot. He described the creature as being a giant lumbering beast, similar in size to a buffalo, but with the ferocity of a lion. My husband had been out on patrol when he saw the creature feasting on berries from a bush, and he couldn't resist getting a closer look. As my ranger husband crept toward the monster, the Hodag suddenly caught sight of him and let out a terrifying roar. My husband turned to run, but the animal was faster than he had anticipated and was hot on his heels. He knew that he had no chance of outrunning that giant four-legged creature, so he sought refuge in some tall grass behind a fallen log to the side of the path. The Hodag charged right past him, snarling and snapping, searching for its prey. My husband lay there in the grass, frozen in terror, for what felt like an eternity, until he was certain that the Hodag had finally moved on. He returned home that night, shaken but alive, having experienced a brush with one of the most feared creatures of the Midwestern wilderness. I could picture the Hodag in my mind, with its giant, gnarled horns and vicious teeth, and I couldn't help but feel grateful that my husband had survived such a dangerous encounter. Although he's no longer with me, I find comfort in remembering the stories he told and the adventures he had, even if they were sometimes terrifying. It reminds me of the raw beauty and untamed wildness of the woods, and it makes me long for the days when he was still here to explore it with me. The strange light and missing time. One time my husband told me a truly strange tale, one that really gave me the shivers from head to toe. It seems he was out on patrol, and he heard some kind of a disturbance in the woods. He walked in there and found a young couple in a clearing having a big argument and shouting a lot. When he asked them what was the problem, they told him a very crazy story. The two of them had planned a romantic evening, setting up their tent in the woods and building themselves a campfire in a pit surrounded by rocks to keep the fire from spreading. The girl pointed out a bright light up in the sky to her boyfriend, which then seemed to become multiple bright lights. They thought it was a police helicopter when it shone a spotlight down onto them, lighting them up blindingly bright. They shouted up at what they thought was a copter until they began to feel themselves being lifted up off the ground and flying upward into the air. Soon they found themselves in an area that they called a hospital, but the doctors and nurses were not human, nor were they your typical gray alien either. They reported being poked and prodded by a bunch of green men who seemed like reptiles and human at the same time. There were security guards stationed at the 2 doors, and those guards looked like upright standing canine creatures. Bipedal dogmen, in other words. The two kept collapsing into arguments, and they were both embarrassed because they were wearing each other's clothing. Hers was torn, being too small to fit on the young man, while his larger clothing hung loosely over his girlfriend's tiny frame. They both insisted they did not choose to be dressed like that. They claimed they woke up on the ground outside of their tent, wearing each other's clothing put on inside out. The campfire was already out and smoldering, so they must have been gone for some time before waking up. Neither of them appeared to be intoxicated, but both appeared to be in some kind of a state of shock. My husband helped them gather their things and walked them to where they had parked their vehicle. Both seemed well enough to drive themselves to the hospital, which is presumably where they went next. Well, that's a sampling of the kinds of stories he used to tell, and a couple of his buddies had some wild tales too. Of course, none of these went into the official record because these guys all wanted to keep their jobs. Let me know if you'd like to hear any more weird ones, and I'll see what I can remember. We got a nice donation from a nicer bloke. Means I can eat this weekend, and that's no joke. It's a PayPal donation from Godzilla Tim, so I can keep working, all thanks to him. Please join me in thanking Godzilla Tim Walker, who made a truly life-saving donation using our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page, the page where you can make instant donations to us that go directly toward food and necessities so that we can keep the episodes coming out. You can also donate through the thanks button under each of our videos, and we get that money when YouTube pays us once a month, which is awesome too. Whichever way you prefer is appreciated by us, and believe me, it goes right back into the show, or into my belly so I can keep doing the show. We also have cool clubs you can join, the secret uncensored Dogman stories that the public isn't allowed to see. And here to tell you all about that is our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank? Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.